It'll take us several Sabbaths to complete the series, and even then, we will not have exhausted the subject because it's an amazing subject and it's very deep. Unfortunately, today there's a lot of people who are thinking they understand the message, and so we have different versions and arguments that are taking place between the different groups who feel that they understand. And I can relate with that because I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist in a pastor's home and, assumed that I understood all that Adventists are supposed to understand. And after having been at Wildwood for a while, I was asked to teach a class on Steps to Christ. So I was happy to do it. That's one of our favorite books. And I taught the class several times. I think it was after the fourth time that I taught the class, I said to myself, there's something in this book that I have not understood before. It wasn't too long after that we were transferred from Wildwood to West Virginia. And one day, the teacher of Adventist history asked me to take his class. And so I agreed to do it. And the subject for that day was the experience of 1888. And as I began preparing for class, I thought to myself, what is there to argue about here? Why has this been such a problem in the Adventist church? But since that time, as I have studied into it and been involved in some of the arguments and so on that have taken place over it, I began to realize it is the most argued subject in the Adventist church. It is the most misunderstood subject in the Adventist church. And the worst part is so many people think they understand when they don't understand. And then there are those who maybe intellectually understand pretty well, but their life is not lived according to what they understand. So their behavior does not show that they have accepted the message, and yet they can preach it. But yet, as you look at their life, you're not attracted to what they preach because you can see they're not living it. So there's a lot of problems connected with this, and I don't know that we'll solve them all in this series, but I hope we can solve a few of the problems and maybe stimulate you to study, like it has me, to study this important subject. Now, if you weren't here for Sabbath school, you'll want to watch that one because I showed the reasons why the Seventh-day Adventist Church needed this message. In this one, I'm going to deal with the messengers that God chose to bring the message to us, because the messengers are also misunderstood. Because the two of them, Jones and Waggoner, apostatized from the Adventist church, it turns most people off right away on the value of what they had to say. Because they apostatized, they figure, well, that's not safe. However, there is one of the special messengers that did not apostatize, and that was Ellen White. So, we are safe, and I have attained my knowledge primarily from the Bible and the writings of Ellen White. But I have done some reading in Jones and Waggoner, and they have some really good ways of expressing things, and it definitely was a blessing. So we're going to study about the messengers. The first quote comes from a book called The Origin and History of Seventh-day Adventists, the second volume, page 291. And it just happens that Spalding is the writer of this 4-volume set, and he used to be at Madison, and so I am especially interested in his insights because I believe he understood true education. And so here's what he said. Waggoner was a product of the schools with a head well packed with learning and with a silver tongue. So one of the instruments, Waggoner, was a gifted speaker. And he could charm people with his messages. He was well educated. Jones was largely self-taught, a convert found as a private in the United States Army who had studied day and night to amass a great store of historical and biblical knowledge. So here we have a man that the world would consider uneducated, but he was self-educated. Back then, that was considered acceptable. Today, I'm not sure it's as acceptable as it used to be, but it is a valid method of being educated. Not only was he naturally abrupt, but he cultivated singularity of speech and manner, early discovering that it was an asset with his audiences. So he developed some things that weren't that good to kind of shock people and to, try to awaken them, I guess, or to draw their attention to it. But these two caught the flame of the gospel together, and they went forth supplementing and reinforcing each other in their work of setting the church on fire. So somehow, these two men were open. They were ministers, and they were open. And the Holy Spirit revealed some important insights to them. And they began to realize that the church and the sermons that were being given were as dry as the hills of Gilboa. And so they developed a desire to present the beauty of the message that they had discovered. Well, it wasn't too long till they ran into deep trouble with the General Conference president over this message. And so they had some difficulties in being able to present. But God arranged in 1888 that these two men had quite a few speaking engagements at the GC. And of course, the General Conference president was providentially sick and he couldn't come to the meetings. And as a result, he tried to warn others to, not let Jones and Waggoner destroy things, but they still didn't take away their speaking appointments. And so they presented a very important message. We won't get to too much of the message today. We did a little in the morning session, but we will in the future. I'll be back in 2 weeks and we'll get into the message. It says, God has given these men, this is now a quote from Ellen White, 1888 Materials, 228. God has given these men, meaning A.T. Jones and E.J. Waggoner. Now, if we're going to believe the prophet, we have to believe that they were given a special message. Otherwise, we have to reject the prophet and say, well, she's mistaken in that area. There's been a lot of running down, casting reflection upon Jones and Waggoner. But God said, these were my two instruments. A message, no, I'm not done that one yet. A message to bear, which is what? Present truth for this time. By the way, it's still present truth. Until this church is giving the loud cry, it is still present truth. A vigor and a vital energy are brought into the church, and where the message is accepted, there is hope and courage and faith beam, notice this, in the countenances of all those who open their eyes to see, their understanding to perceive, and their hearts to receive the great treasure of truth. Now, I don't know whether you've noticed, but there are few Seventh-day Adventists that when you see them, their faces shine. If their face is shining, they have gotten the message. They've understood it. And unfortunately, there's too many whose faces are not shining because they haven't gotten it. Now, it's not enough just to get it intellectually. Your face won't shine that way. It has to be an experience that you have it, and then your face shines, and people start noticing something different about this person because their face is shining, and their words, of course, are a blessing as well. Elder Jones and Waggoner were given a special work to do for these last days. That was 1888 Materials, 1395. And let me just say this about Jones and Waggoner. They were basically driven out of the church because of so many people who didn't like the message that they were bearing. And yet, it was the most Christ-centered message, the most wonderful message that they were giving, and yet people didn't like it, and many of them in high places didn't like it. And so they literally drove them out. Now, we need to learn a lesson in that. No matter how we get treated, we should not go out. And these men should not have gone out because of that. It will be no excuse in the judgment that, well, the way I was treated made me go out. That won't hold water in the judgment. They had been given a very precious message, and that message, if they had experienced it as much as they should have, they would not have gone out. They may have suffered from pride as well. You know, if everywhere you go, there's a revival and people are giving their hearts to Jesus, you can start thinking you're pretty special, that you're somebody beyond somebody else. So I don't know exactly what all the reasons were, why they went out. One of them came back in, I always forget which one it was, but the other one never did. And so that's a very sad aspect. But that doesn't detract that while they were in, and while these kind of statements were made about them, they were special instruments of God. God has given Brother Jones and Brother Waggoner a message for the people. You do not believe that God has upheld them, but He has given them precious light, and their message has fed the people of God. Now, notice this. When you reject the message borne by these men, you reject who? Christ, the giver of the message. So it was serious for them. When those, there were only about 100 pastors there at that general conference. It was a pretty small meeting. That was back in the days when we were not very big. And only 100 pastors, but most of those pastors rejected the message. They went home to their room. They went back to their room after they heard the message, and they started ridiculing, and they started making fun of the messengers and arguing against what they had to say. And it developed an attitude of rejection at that conference. And so they missed out on this, but even more important, they rejected Jesus. You know, I suppose if you ask the Seventh-day Adventists, if Jesus were to come today, would you accept him or reject him? They would say, I would accept him. But the problem is, if we are in the spiritual condition that the church was at that time, we would have done the same thing. We would have rejected Jesus. In fact, we did reject him because he sent Ellen White, Jones, and Waggoner to present a very important message to us, and we said we don't want it. That's not good. And therefore, we ought to wake up to the fact that we can do that. And we need to ask God to help us not to do that. The next time he sends a messenger to us, not to reject that one, because Jones and Waggoner are dead. God can't work through them today, but he will always have messengers that will present this truth. And this makes it a real issue. 1888 Materials, page 1122. We know that Brother Jones has been giving the message for this time, meat in due season, for the starving flock of God. Why were they starving? Because the other pastors were not presenting real light. And so they were starving for the truth. Conversions, genuine conversions were rare. Oh, there was lots of what looked like conversions. You know, people were joining the church, getting baptized and all that. But the problem was real conversion was rare. Brother Jones has borne the message from church to church and from state to state, and light and freedom and the outpouring of the Spirit of God have attended the Word. So this, of course, is after 1888. Different places where people appreciated Jones and Waggoner would invite them to come. Sometimes it would be a church. Sometimes it would be a camp meeting. And whenever they would be allowed to present this message, there would be a revival. And people would get converted. And they would say, you know, I have the best Christian experience I've ever had in my whole life. Or I lost it and I got it back again. And it was just going around the church, not supported like it should be from the top, but it was going and it couldn't get stopped. You know, for a while. It was just spreading all over. Now, some people that are presenting the 1888 message don't tell you the other part of the story, but we do need to understand that as well as we look at the messengers. Here in the 1888 message, page 25, which, by the way, is all the letters that Ellen White wrote in regard to what happened in 1888. It's a 4-volume set, and I've read the entire 4 volumes. It's quite a bit of reading, but and a lot of repetition, but it's still got some pretty valuable information. Elder J.H. Waggoner, that's the father of the Waggoner at 1888, has loved discussions and contention. I fear that E.J. Waggoner, that's the one that God used, has cultivated a love for the same. So here was a character flaw. You know, God doesn't pick perfect people to preach his message. And so here was a character flaw. He liked to argue. He was sure he was right, and in this case, he was right most of the time. And he loved to argue, but you know, you don't present truth arguing. It doesn't do any good to argue. If we get in the mood of arguing, the best thing to do is to kneel down and pray until the spirit of argument goes away, because that comes from the enemy. But he had a weakness in that, which was partially responsible for as much rejection as occurred. We need now good, humble religion, especially those that preach the 1888 message need to be humble, and they need to be experiencing the result of the message so that they can not argue and not have these flaws. E.J. Waggoner needs humility, meekness, and Brother Jones can be a power for good if he will constantly cultivate practical godliness. So he had some problems too, that he tended to not be living always what he was preaching. He needed to be more following the religion. If he will constantly cultivate practical godliness, that he may reach or teach this to the people. You know, people pay more attention to what we do than what we say. And so it doesn't do any good to go around preaching the right message, but the character doesn't support the message. Now, again, you know, God uses imperfect people, and so we don't want to turn off some instruments simply because they're not fully living the message. But if we're the messenger, we need to make sure, by God's grace, that we're living the message. Because then, if we're not, and the message is rejected, we're partially at fault for rejecting that message. Page 32 says, I have sent copies of letters written to Brethren E.J. Waggoner and A.T. Jones, to Elder G.I. Butler, in reference to introducing and keeping in front and making prominent subjects on which there are differences of opinion. Now, one of the things that agitated the delegates at the GC was the different viewpoints on who was the king of the North. And so, if Jones and Waggoner had been willing to bury that argument right now, it would have been much better for the special message of righteousness by faith that they were going to present. But they found that difficult, and so did the other brethren. You know, it's easy to lay down an argument if the other side will lay it down. But if the other side won't lay it down, it's hard not to lay it down. But that's the test of character. We need to lay it down, even if it looks like they're going to win the argument, because argument is not the way to establish truth. I sent this not that you should make them weapons to use against the brethren mentioned, but that the very same cautions and carefulness be exercised by you to preserve harmony as you would have these brethren exercise. Now, you can see if you look closely what Ellen White is guided to tell them. She's telling Elder Butler, lay it down. Don't argue about these things where there's differences of opinion. And then she informs Jones and Waggoner about it to lay it down too, but neither side wants to lay it down. That's part of the problem. Next one. In 1888 materials, again, page 1240, it says, I am indeed sorry both for Brother Prescott and Brother Jones. So as time went on, W.W. Prescott also caught the vision for this truth and was used for a time in a powerful manner. In fact, there were some meetings in Australia that were for the public, actually. And as he presented these truths, the audience was amazed. And Ellen White said afterward that she had been shown that this is the kind of evangelism that Adventists need to do. But evangelists in general don't understand that method of evangelism. And so we don't have the kind of results that happened at that that series of camp meetings. See, camp meeting used to be for the public as well as Adventists, but and that's the way that series was. I am indeed sorry both for Brother Prescott and Brother Jones. I have felt very anxious in regard to them both, but especially in regard to Brother Jones, who is so ardent in his faith and does not manifest the caution he should in his statements by pen or voice. So here's another problem that Jones had. He was a little on the rash side. And there's a book out written about his life. I don't agree with all the conclusions. I think the writer was trying to discredit him in writing the book. But one thing I noticed in the book, and that is that as long as Jones would be corrected by the prophet, his mistakes weren't too big, because she would tell him, you need to stop that, and he would pay attention to her. But when the time came that he wouldn't listen anymore, and here's when he wouldn't listen. She said, don't try to help Kellogg. Don't go and try to rescue him, because if you try, he'll get you mixed up. And that's what happened. He got mixed up. In fact, you got to be careful of some of his later statements because they have pantheism in them. But while Ellen White was supporting him, he was on target. But then he got off because he didn't listen to her. And from there, of course, he left the church. So these weaknesses can have some dangerous aspects. He does not manifest caution. Does not manifest the caution he should in his statements by pen or voice. So he makes exaggerated statements. In fact, there was another man who thought he understood righteousness by faith by the name of Ballinger. And I believe the statement in that book that I referred to is correct. That Jones would stretch a point as far as it could go without being error, and Ballinger took that point and went farther. And that's the tendency when we try to exaggerate and go as to the outer limit. In fact, truth, I believe, is like a highway, like a good road, that there is a ditch on either side to take away the water, and if you stay on the road, you might be right in the middle of the road. That's the best place. Or you might stray over here a little bit. But as long as you don't go in the ditch, you're okay on either side. And yet, there is always the danger that if you're clear out right next to the ditch, that the people that listen to you will go in the ditch. And so we need to try to be right in the middle of the road and present the truth right in the middle. From page 1755, I attended a meeting of the conference after you spoke yesterday, and I could not roll off the burden which came upon me. The way in which you spoke did not leave the best impression upon the people. So here she's talking about, I think, Jones, and she's saying, I listened to the way you said things in that meeting, and it wasn't good. You should not have spoken the way you did. That night, I was greatly burdened, and one of authority said to me, say to my servant, Alonzo Jones, that he is to stand as a representative man. In other words, Elder Jones, God is telling you, your character needs to reflect the message that you have been preaching. And there's danger if your character does not represent what you're preaching. And this, I believe, is happening still today. He is to put on Christ Jesus and is to be guarded in his attitude and words, so that he shall not give others an excuse for being dictatorial and overbearing. So if he makes sharp thrusts at what somebody else believes or their idea that he doesn't like and so on in a committee meeting, he alienates people from him. But then the biggest danger is he alienates them from the message that God has given him. And so this, the prophet tried to help him. And I imagine he made some progress. I don't know the exact whole story, but he didn't make enough. Now this one's a little more serious than the others. First Elected Messages 377. I was attending a meeting and a large congregation were present. In my dream, you were presenting the subject of faith and the imputed righteousness of Christ by faith. Now that is the message, and we'll study in more detail. That is the message that God was wanting to bring to the Adventist church. And the problem was they thought they already had it. And it's still a problem today. How can you help people that think they have something when they don't have it? It's the hardest thing on earth to do. That was the problem Jesus had when he came to earth before. They thought they had the truth, but they didn't. And Jesus was trying to present it, but they thought it was error. And the same problem has come upon the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And God was trying to correct it here, but there were some problems. It says, you repeated several times that works amounted to nothing, that there were no conditions. Just believe you have it. No conditions. Just believe you have it. This, he was going too far in his statements. You repeated several times that works amounted to nothing, that there were no conditions. The matter was presented in the light, that I knew minds would be confused and would not receive the correct impression in reference to faith and works. I decided to write to you. God didn't want these instruments to be damaged. And so whenever they got off, God sent a message to try to correct them. But this one's more serious because it's theological. And there were things that he didn't understand as well as he should have. And therefore, he was indicating there were no conditions to be justified. And so the prophet warned him, yes, there is. And don't cast reflection on works. You know, when a person is truly justified, that's when the real works begin. That's when the real works can happen. Before that, it's just human effort, you see. But after justification, it's no longer human effort, at least not apart from Christ, but it is because of Christ in the life that the works appear. So this has been very well presented in the writings of Ellen White. So nobody needs to get mixed up about this, and I read some of them in the first session when you get to watch that. You state this matter too strongly. There are conditions to our receiving justification and sanctification and the righteousness of Christ. Now there's the whole message in capsule form. The 1888 message was all about justification, sanctification, and the righteousness of Christ. I know your meaning, but you leave a wrong impression upon many minds. While good works will not save even one soul, yet it is impossible for even one soul to be saved without good works. So, you have to be careful how you say it today, because you get different groups stirred up about this when you talk about the relation of faith and works. But I have a study later where it'll try to put it all together exactly the way it's supposed to be. But you can see that Jones had a little bit of lack at the time that this happened in understanding the proper relationship between faith and works. He was getting, and this is not abnormal probably. If somebody has been in the works ditch and then they see the beautiful message of Christ our righteousness, there is a danger that they will go in the other ditch. And I think that's what happened to him. He got a little bit off on faith, but praise God, the prophet doesn't do that because they get their messages from God. In Review and Herald of April 18, 1893, it says, "Those who are filled with unbelief can discern the least thing that has an objectionable appearance. And by beholding the objectionable feature, they can lose sight of all the evidence that God has given." See, that's a human tendency. We see some flaw in somebody, and then we lose all the blessing that God tried to give us. And that's what people are doing, and there's still people doing that today. Don't let that happen. I always check any uninspired, by uninspired I mean they're not a prophet. I always check out any inspired writer, even Jones and Waggoner, with the inspired writers. That's always the thing to do. But don't reject something because somebody's not a full instrument that they ought to be. It says they can hold the objectionable atom under the magnifying glasses of their imagination until the atom looks like a world. Why take so much account of that which may appear to you as objectionable in the messenger? Why are you doing that to Jones and Waggoner? That's not appropriate to do. In the 5th manuscript releases, page 219, it says, "I have had the question asked, what do you think of this light that these men are presenting? Why, I have been presenting it to you for the last 45 years. So by the time that God was using these men, God had been trying to help the Adventist church for 45 years already. Isn't that interesting? This is what I have been trying to present before your minds." When Brother Waggoner brought out these ideas in Minneapolis, it was the first clear teaching on this subject from any human lips I had heard. Wow. Out of all the pastors, they were the first ones that she heard to give the message clearly. Not perfectly, but clearly. Accepting the conversations between myself and my husband, I have said to myself, it is because God has presented it to me in vision that I see it so clearly, and they cannot see it because they have never had it presented to them as I have. And when another presented it, every fiber of my heart said, Amen. So that's another reason why I like to check everything out with what God revealed through Ellen White, because at the time she wrote this, she had been used of God for 45 years to present the truth. Now, one interesting fact, the best presentation of the message is in the book Steps to Christ. When that book was to be printed, the church would not print it. They refused to print it. The argument had gotten so heated and so many didn't like the message, they wouldn't even print it. And it had to be printed in a separate publishing house in order to get in print. Now we welcome it, but as I said, we don't understand it. And it might take somebody 4 times through it to find that out. That's what happened to me. So, in closing, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from this message about the messengers? Number 1, Jones and Waggoner were God's instruments. As long as you're willing to check what they have to say against the inspired writings, you don't need to worry about the danger of reading their books. Number 2, their message wasn't perfect in every respect. They too were, getting a hold of the message. They were trying to understand it, and sad to say, before they probably got a full, complete understanding, they went out. 3, we should not reject them because of faults. Just because people can tell you their faults, don't use that as a means of rejecting the light they were given. Number 4, look at the message, not the messenger. That's really the adult Christian view. We take the message, we study it out like the Bereans did, and if it's true, we accept it. We don't worry about how good the instrument was. Number 5, neither should we worship them. There are people who worship Jones and Waggoner. That's all they can talk about. Just constantly talk about it. And they put together lists of Ellen White's quotes about Jones and Waggoner. But they don't include the part that I put in here today. They put only the positive things. 6, God has waited a long time for us to understand this message. Don't you think it's about time for us to understand this message? Not just in theory, but in practice, in our lives, to where it will cause us to be the kind of Christians we ought to be. And number 7, the clearest giving of this message was in the Bible and Ellen G. White. And so that's where I've gone, and that's where I'll share most of what I have found in regard to this wonderful message. But as we close today, I'm wondering how many of you will be willing to say to the Lord, I'm going to dig into this message and seek to understand it as fully as I can, with the idea that what I find out, I'm going to believe that God can put into my life, and He can make me the kind of person that's a reflection of this message. How many are willing to make that decision this morning? Just hold your hand. Amen. Okay, so we're going to have some exciting things in the next few months. As each month, I'll be presenting 2 of these, and it'll take us several months, but in that meantime, you'll have plenty of time to study, and what I'm expecting is that you're going to have a revival. It's going to give you an experience that you've never had before, and it's going to put a beam in your face that some people are going to say, what happened to you? What's different about you? Because when you really are doing the message, practicing the message, it changes your life. God bless.